Day 240 Ezekiel chapter 5, 6, 7, and 8. Have you ever had a moment when someone you trusted looked at your life and said, something needs to change? Maybe it was a friend who noticed that you were becoming distant. Maybe it was a parent, a spouse, a teacher, or even your own conscience telling you that something wasn't right. Sometimes, the hardest thing is not knowing that something is wrong. The hardest thing is being willing to look closely enough to admit it. God sees what people cannot, or will not, see, and He calls His people to examine what has taken His place in their hearts. God communicates that Jerusalem will face severe consequences because of the people's continued rebellion. The issue wasn't simply that they had made mistakes. Their hearts had repeatedly turned away from God. They had received God's instructions, experienced His presence, and yet continued choosing their own way. One of the sobering lessons here is that repeated choices eventually become a direction. Jerusalem had been given a privileged position, yet the people had rejected God's ways, rather than living according to them. Think about that in our own lives. Very few people wake up one morning and decide, today I'm going to completely destroy my relationships, compromise my values, neglect my responsibilities, or walk away from everything I believe. Usually it happens gradually. One compromise becomes another. One dishonest decision becomes easier the next time. One unhealthy habit becomes part of the routine. One neglected relationship becomes emotional distance. One ignored warning becomes a lifestyle. That's why we need to pay attention to the things we repeatedly tolerate. What we repeatedly allow into our lives can eventually become what controls our lives. Ezekiel reminds us that God doesn't only care about our outward appearance. He cares about the direction of our hearts. Then Ezekiel speaks against the mountains of Israel because they had become associated with places of false worship. The people had turned away from the worship of God and embraced idols. And here's where the passage becomes deeply personal. An idol doesn't necessarily have to be a carved statue sitting on a table. An idol can be anything that occupies the place in our lives that belongs to God. It could be money, success, career, popularity, a relationship, our children, our appearance, our reputation, even our own opinions. And sometimes the idol is not something bad in itself. The problem is when a good thing becomes the ultimate thing. We can love our families without making them our gods. We can pursue success without allowing success to define our worth. We can enjoy money without allowing money to control our decisions. We can use technology without allowing our screens to consume our attention. The question Ezekiel quietly places before us is, what has become so important to me that I am willing to compromise my relationship with God to keep it? That is not always an easy question. But sometimes spiritual growth begins when we are courageous enough to ask it. Ezekiel is given a vision in which God shows him what is happening within Jerusalem. And God repeatedly tells him to look at what they are doing. Look at what is happening here. Look at what is happening there. The people may have appeared religious on the outside, but God was revealing what was happening beneath the surface. And this is incredibly relevant to our world today. We live in an age of carefully managed appearances. We can choose the photograph. We can edit the video. We can write the caption. We can present the successful version of ourselves. People may see the smile, the achievement, the beautiful home, the successful business, the happy family. But God sees beyond the presentation. The people in Ezekiel's vision had convinced themselves that God did not see what they were doing. But God did. That should challenge us, not frighten us, but challenge us, because it means that our private life matters just as much as our public life. Who are we when nobody is watching? How do we speak when we are angry? What do we do when we have an opportunity to be dishonest and nobody would know? How do we treat people who cannot benefit us? What do we watch? What do we think about? What attitudes are growing quietly inside us? These are important questions because character is often formed in places where there is no audience. The people were still surrounded by religious practices, yet their hearts had moved far away from God. They were going through motions, but their worship had become corrupted. This is something we can easily understand today. It is possible to attend church and still be far from God. It is possible to know Bible verses and still refuse to obey God's principles. It is possible to pray publicly, but live very differently privately. It is possible to look spiritually successful, while the heart is becoming spiritually empty. The issue isn't that church attendance, prayer, Bible reading, or religious activities are unimportant. They are important. But God doesn't want empty activity. He wants our hearts. And perhaps that's one of the most important questions these chapters ask us. Am I simply going through religious routines? Or am I genuinely allowing God to transform the way I live? Because real faith eventually shows up in our choices. It shows up in how we treat people. It shows up in how we handle power. It shows up in how we respond when we're wrong. It shows up in whether we can forgive. It shows up in whether we tell the truth. It shows up in whether we care about people who have nothing to offer us. Our private choices reveal what our hearts truly value. The people are confronted with the consequences of their choices. And there is an important lesson here. God's warnings are invitations to change before consequences become unavoidable. Sometimes we know exactly what needs to change, but we keep postponing it. I'll deal with it later. It's not really that serious. Everyone else is doing it. That's just the way I am. God understands. But Ezekiel reminds us that God's patience should never be mistaken for approval. If there is something in our lives that God has been putting on our hearts, perhaps the question isn't, how long can I continue doing this? Perhaps the better question is, what would happen if I actually listened and changed? Maybe it's time to apologize. Maybe it's time to establish a boundary. Maybe it's time to walk away from a destructive habit. Maybe it's time to stop pretending. Maybe it's time to return to God. Sometimes the most spiritual thing we can do is simply say, Lord, you are right. I need to change. We come to the part where we read about a time when the consequences of the people's actions would finally arrive. There is something sobering about that. We often examine our lives only after something goes wrong, after the marriage is struggling, after the child has become distant, after the business collapses, after trust has been broken, after our health, finances, or relationships are affected. But wisdom says, examine the foundation before the building begins to crack. Don't wait for a crisis to ask whether your priorities are right. Don't wait until your relationships are damaged to learn how to communicate. Don't wait until your children are grown to decide that you want to be present. Don't wait until you are exhausted to recognize that your life is out of balance. And don't wait until you feel spiritually empty to start seeking God again. Regular self-examination is a gift. Every now and then we need to pause and ask, what is growing in me? What am I becoming? What am I allowing? What has my attention? And is the life I'm building consistent with the person I say I want to become? Ultimately today, reading is a call to wake up and look closely. God exposes what the people have hidden. He confronts their misplaced worship. He reveals their private compromises. And he shows that outward appearances cannot hide the condition of the heart. But perhaps the most important takeaway for us is not simply God judges wrongdoing. It is that God wants us to notice what is happening in our hearts before it destroys what matters. So today, perhaps we don't need to examine everyone else. We don't need to point fingers. We don't need to ask who needs to hear this message. Maybe we simply need to ask ourselves, what is God asking me to look at? What have I been tolerating? What has taken too much space in my heart? Where have my private choices become different from my public values? And most importantly, what needs to change? Because sometimes God's correction is not meant to push us away. It is meant to wake us up, turn us around, and bring us back to Him. Thank you for spending these few moments reflecting with me. Don't be afraid to look closely. What God reveals, He can also help us change.